My first question, I think, is your lesson 2 about not going for existing in the warlords, for example, in Afghanistan, but trying to go at the grassroots level. In the case of Afghanistan, would the warlords have allowed that kind of grassroots, let's go below them, to happen, especially since these are foreign forces and foreign interests coming in? So how would you square the kind of fact that warlords have a lot of political power and don't necessarily want it to dissipate?
I think it'll certainly be a challenge. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do to come up against these powerful figures. But I think what we do is we often overestimate their power. There are a lot of people who just simply do not want them around and feel like they have to partner with them or do what they say or go under their banner because they're the only alternative. And so what I would propose is to try to give another type of alternative, another conduit. Because I think people, not all people, but most people would have, if given a choice, would rather engage directly than through that.
Down front here.
Hi, Lydia. John Darwin. One of the lessons which doesn't appear to be on your list is, wouldn't it have been better if the US had been slightly more honest and transparent about its objectives before it went in there, so we actually understood what they were trying to achieve? Mm-hmm. I mean, if it was just straightly, exercising dominating both countries, wouldn't it have been just easier to go in there with actually no tokenist approach to democracy?
Well, I would disagree in a sense that it wasn't a tokenist approach to democracy, but I think the problem that you might be pointing to is the fact that the reasons for going into both conflicts have shifted. At first it was WMD, the threat of Saddam, then we say we're promoting democracy, then we say, well, we can't leave because of the insurgency. So I understand your point about this kind of shifting reasons, and yes, they do need to be more clear, but these are very, complicated conflicts, and the natures of them shift over time.
At the back there.
Thanks. My name's Will Clegg. I wanted to ask you a question about your fourth lesson learnt, the need to separate the foreign fighters from the domestic insurgents, then to try and integrate the latter into the political process. And I suppose, especially in Afghanistan, two real questions arise from that. The first is an ethical dilemma about integrating people who, in the past and presently, represent a very neo-fundamentalist political agenda into the political system, and the effect that has on many people in the country. And the second is an institutional question that it would seem to be a very good way to increase elite divisions about very fundamental institutional questions, like whether we even want to have democracies and whether we want to be a state or some other form of political entity. I wonder how those two tensions and dynamics play out in your mind.
Well, when I was recently in Afghanistan, people pointed to that dynamic that you said. It's a lot of conservative actors are tending to filter back into the political process, but I think that we can't ignore that these actors exist. I mean, they represent real interests in the country. And so if we're going to stick true to our word that we do want to have greater political participation, and that participation is going to lead to greater stability, we're going to have to take some sort of risk and let these processes play out. And I think the key to mitigating that is to try to bolster other actors who are, say, more secular or have of other interests, because what you try to see is a kind of a balance of a wide variety of interests. And it's a risky strategy, but in the end, it's only when true stability will come about.
Michael Sexton, you talked about Afghanistan as a whole, but I suppose I'd rather assume that these problems were greater in some parts of the country than in others. I'm wondering, is that right? And if so, whether it's possible to deal with the difficulties in segments, in other words, to make and to hold ground in some parts of the country and then to move on, as it were, into others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you might be referring to is this kind of ink spot strategy. Start off with one section and then have it try to spread out as a whole. And I think that's an adequate strategy in some sense, and certainly all politics is local. You have to deal with each local dynamic as it plays out. But the key is not to work on them in isolation, to make sure that they fit into some sort of grander theme or strategy that you have in place.
Hi, my name is Cherie Wax. I would like to ask you about two groups and individuals which are active in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. One is RAWA, the Revolutionary Afghan Women's Association, which they've had representatives here several times, and they get virtually no support from anyone. The fundraisers have about 20 people at them, and yet they're trying very hard, running schools, orphanages and so on. And also the only female independent member of Parliament who's under death threats and has a shocking time of it. Why aren't those sort of groups and individuals being helped?
It's a good question. I think they should be helped. I think that this is exactly this grassroots dynamic that I was trying to point to earlier. It's working with groups like that that are the key. And you mentioned two groups that are involved in gender politics and women's issues, and that's not something that we spoke about in detail. But in both conflict zones, the role of women is absolutely crucial. They say if you educate one woman, it's not just benefiting her, but her family and extended family. So the role of women in terms of reconstruction and stability is extremely important. And secondly, I would definitely agree with you that these groups do need to be supported more in terms of a greater reconstruction strategy.
Hi, Steve Townsend. Thanks for a very informative talk. Your point 4 about, I think, the need for driving a wedge between foreign fighters and local fighters. Mm-hmm. How exactly do you do that? How has it been done? And are there ways of doing it better?
Well, the clearest example is what happened in Iraq. And the way that it happened is that we capitalized on an existing problem between al-Qaeda and the insurgency itself. We can't take all the credit for doing that. We recognized a conflict between al-Qaeda and the Iraqi insurgents, and it was a conflict over this kind of overbearing nature of al-Qaeda in the conflict. They wanted to control what was going on, they wanted to govern, they were committing horrible atrocities against people in the communities in the name of Islamic government. And the indigenous fighters got fed up with it. They said, who are these al-Qaeda guys? They're not helping us anymore. And I think what we did right was recognizing it and then capitalizing it and reaching out to the indigenous insurgents, not just leaving it alone, saying, okay, this conflict is going to play out and eventually they'll come on our side. No, what we did do is we made a concerted effort to reach out at that point, and I think that that's a crucial way to get it done. Oftentimes you can't create these conflicts, but they'll inevitably arise, and I think the key is to recognize them early on and to get in there.
My name is Jeremy Gilling. A few weeks ago, many of the people in this room would have heard a speech by a woman professor of history at Oxford. And Anthony, perhaps you can remember her name? Margaret someone?
Macmillan, yeah.
Macmillan, that's it, yeah. And she raised, I guess, an 11th lesson, which was the failure of the US and the coalition of the willing to learn the lessons of history, and in particular to learn from, or even maybe just were oblivious to, the lessons that Britain learned in Iraq in the 1920s. So would you agree with that?
Yes and no. I think that history is certainly important, and especially in societies that are so rooted in their history like Iraq and Afghanistan, we definitely need to be paying attention to it. But at the same time, we can't be held hostage by history. These are dynamic societies that change, and Iraq in 1920s is not Iraq in 2000 or 2003. So I think Afghanistan, at least in the initial stages, was a clear lesson or a clear demonstration of how we learned the lessons of history. We obviously saw what happened to the Soviets and the British when they had major military ground forces coming in, and we said, right, that didn't work, so we're going to have these quick reaction forces kind of swoop in and prosecute the conflict that way. So yes, it is important to definitely take a look at the lessons of history, but again, I would say we can't be held hostage by history and realize that dynamics do change.
Martinez.
Martin Letts from the Lowy Institute. Thanks very much, Lydia. And I apologise if this question was asked while I was on my way down from the gods. You talked about the importance of training for effective policing. What I'm about to say is not original. I've heard Anthony say it before. even if you have an effective police force, if you don't have an effective body of law, or the police force is there to enforce, what's the point of having effective policing? Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that that's certainly a true statement, and that's why the need of not just training them in security operations, but in the rule of law is very important. But also building up, institutions of justice like the justice ministries and various courts. In Iraq right now, you have this huge backlog of cases, and it's resulted in detainees being in extended custody far longer than they should have. And of course, we know the follow-on effects of that. If detainees are in custody, either when they shouldn't be or for too long a period of time, they come out feeling disgruntled, they contribute further to the violence in the insurgency. So absolutely, setting up the associated mechanisms of law and order, particularly, the law part of it is crucial.
Brilliant.
Lydia, Brendan Maxwell, I'm a serving army officer who served both in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly concur with your comments about the Afghan National Police and the challenges of the judiciary.
Mm-hmm.
Having seen the Kajaki Dam project in Helmand Valley, what are your comments about sustainable economies to be alternatives to the narco economy when clearly a poppy farmer gets $10 US a poppy?
Mm-hmm.
The advent of this Kajaki Dam project, what are your thoughts about sustainable economies for these people in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, economic development, of course, is crucial, and I can't speak with too much expertise regarding that particular project or this topic at large. But obviously, people go toward poppy production because they don't have any alternatives. It's far more expensive to grow wheat than it is to grow poppies. They have a clear market, and one of the anecdotes that I was told when I was in Afghanistan, particularly about the poppy production, was that it's an extremely organized force. So you have people coming in to the farmers directly to pick up their product. They don't need to struggle to get it to a market. They don't have to deal with transportation or logistics. The people come to them. So if the same effort can be made in terms of other farming practices, I think that would go a long way in terms of developing other models either for agriculture or for economics. So not only do you have to grow and develop industries, but you have to develop a market for it and the logistics to get it to that market. So I think these are two key issues in terms of a sustainable economy: transport and having a market mechanism. And I'm not talking about the market capitalism that we have now. I'm just simply stating a market with baskets and people coming in to buy fruit, kind of thing. So
down the front here.
Hi, my name's Diana Jenkins. It's probably related actually to the question of economic prosperity down the track, but I was interested in the strategy for the repatriation of refugees because I think there's sort of an assumption that the conflicts end and people will just come flooding back over the border, and I'm interested in sort of the limitations of that kind of thinking and what the strategy is for actually encouraging people to come home.
As far as I can tell, there is no concerted strategy. So that's a worry, an issue. On the other hand, I mean, the people coming back from, say, Syria or Iran or other places, going back to their old neighborhoods in Iraq, have integrated reasonably well. However, there are, and these are usually, middle class, they have the means, but there are people who don't. They fled with just the clothes on their back and a small satchel. And they're not going to have the wherewithal to come back even if they need to. And unfortunately, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen any type of concerted strategy to aid them into coming back. And so I think you've pointed to a real need.
Sorry, up there first, and then Mark.
Hi, Stephen Hodges. Two questions about Afghanistan. You mentioned that Afghanistan is a much more tribal society than Iraq. How does the Taliban fit into that tribal framework? That's the first question. And the second question is, in respect of the Taliban, do you see it as feasible for them to be brought into the regime, or are they too radical for that to be a plausible outcome?
To your first question, there have been tribes in Afghanistan who have more traditionally been allied with the Taliban forces. At the same time, you've heard of tribes allying with the Taliban, just for the simple fact that their rival tribe is not. So it's not because they necessarily agree with what the Taliban is doing, but they can't be seen to supporting the same mechanisms or the same coalitions that their rival tribe is. So that's kind of a very difficult conundrum to get around, but I think that there are ways to do it. And I think the key thing that we need to recognize is that often people are allied with the Taliban not because of any ideological affiliation. That is the case sometimes. But it's just because of these, convoluted tribal politics and other things that we can kind of try to get around in a sense. And to your second question about if the Taliban can be reintegrated, I think that we need to recognize that there's Taliban and there's Taliban. They're not a cohesive force. There are certainly elements that have been repatriated back into the political process, and they're in there now. And there are certainly other elements that can be additionally brought in. And the task is to kind of separate these hardliners, spoilers, elements that just should not be given a voice in the government with those that can and should.
Mark O'Neill.
Mark O'Neill from the Lowy Institute. Thanks, Lydia. I think it was your second point, which went to the Clausewitzian idea that you have to understand the nature of a conflict that you're involved in, and the statesman, that's the supreme art. Now, clearly the CPA failed to do that when you made the point about they didn't recognise an insurgency or an incipient insurgency when they had one. But to be fair to Bremer and others, that's often a problem. People don't recognise an insurgency till the 4,000th car bomb or what have you. Mm-hmm. Given that it seems to be an enduring problem with our approach to insurgencies, what practical measures do you see within Western states that could address that imperative to actually recognise the nature of the conflict, or to recognise the nature of an insurgency when you see one, rather than just responding to what you want to see? How could we address that within governments?
That's a good question, and I think one that requires a lot of thought. I mean, one kind of off the top of my head idea is trying on our own to kind of come up with criteria of what constitutes an insurgency. And of course it's going to be totally imperfect, and it'll differ from case to case. But kind of establishing some sort of broad guidelines for what we might be able to consider as an insurgency as opposed to dead enders like we thought we were could be a beginning step to that. But I think you've asked an important question that probably would require a couple of weeks policy work and thinking to do, but that's kind of a, off the top of my head idea of trying to establish clear criteria in our own mind. I would say about the, the CPA days and our failure to recognize it early on. I'd like to be fair to the CPA too. I mean, I worked for them, and so I was one of those people at the time who said, "Oh no, they're also dead enders." No. But looking back on it, it was a clear mistake. I mean, there were people out there telling us, and the CIA themselves, the station in Iraq, was saying at the time, "No, political advisors, you are dealing with an insurgency, not dead enders." So if we had followed on that advice sooner, I think that would have been obviously a lot better. So we do have to acknowledge some mistakes in that regard.
Yep.
Jamie Travis. Just in relation to your seventh lesson, I think it is, sixth lesson, sorry, engaging regional partners. Six,
yeah.
Seven. I'm particularly interested in the role of Syria, and could you shed some light on the steps that have been taken or a plan to be taken to engage Syria as a regional partner?
Well, I think that you've seen a warming of relations between Syria and the United States. And that warming resulted, I think, of a second-level engagement, especially on the intelligence level, between the United States and Syria. Because while political relationships were very bad at a certain point in time, the intelligence links between the two intelligence agencies had continued. Now, often these kind of fly under the radar, and necessarily reasons for that, but oftentimes they can kind of lead up to more direct political engagement. I think Syria's willingness to be more cooperative on the peace process, their disengagement from Lebanon, being more cooperative on that sense. So these other dynamics have aided in the U.S. relationship on that point. And I think that Syria is realizing the price that they have to pay for isolation. And they kind of made a calculation that, okay, we need to be a little bit more directly engaged with the United States.
I'll use the chairman's privilege and ask a question. You've talked a lot about the lessons of one conflict to the other. What about the connections between the two conflicts and the ways that the two conflicts are linked, and what challenges that poses for the US and for the international coalition in the future as it tries to kind of balance, withdrawals from Iraq versus, adding additional forces to Afghanistan?
Well, I think two clear connections, and both of them deal with insurgency. One is that you clearly have an al-Qaeda presence in both of those countries. And while they're not operationally directed by kind of some centralized mechanism, they both exist. So while one is going down, we see the other going up. It's almost like like a seesaw. The more, our weight is shifted on Iraq and it's bringing the violence down, it kind of pops up in Afghanistan. And I think that's just a result of limited resources. We need to acknowledge that we do have limited resources that just can't be spread around willy-nilly across the globe. The other related point to the insurgency as well is this idea of tactics. We've seen, especially I saw this a lot working at NYPD, insurgent and terrorist groups learn from each other. They monitor what's going on in those other theaters. They take a look at what type of bombs they're using, the type of propaganda, all of that kind of stuff. And a couple of years ago, you saw the spike in IEDs in Afghanistan, and before you never had that. Now, where did they get this idea from? Clearly it was Iraq. Not only did they get the idea there, but they used that particular technology. And there were also rumors of Iraqi trainers going into Afghanistan and training Afghan fighters on terms of the tactics and lessons learned that they themselves had. So while we're trying to get lessons learned from Afghanistan and Iraq, so are the insurgents. They're taking a look saying, what can I learn from Iraq that I can, wreak havoc in Afghanistan?
Maybe we can all come together and have a conference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Tom McDonald from the Canadian Consulate. Just to follow on your comments about regional strategies and Syria, one of the top-of-mind issues right now, of course, is the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and I just wonder if you have any comments about that in terms of lessons that have been learned in the Iraqi context that could be applied to resolving that issue.
I think the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan is far more complicated than between, say, Syria and Iraq. It was said to me by someone that I was talking to in Afghanistan that Pakistan has a clear interest in keeping this region destabilized. Its very survival depends on that, because if the region is stable, Afghanistan has legitimate claims to their territory. And if the region is stable, then Pakistan could potentially be swallowed up by India. Whereas Syria has a greater interest in the stability of that region. It'll thrive more in the stability of, say, that region in the Gulf and the Middle East than Pakistan does. The problems in Pakistan are just really outstanding to me. I mean, I have a hard time kind of wrapping my mind around it. And every single person that I talked to in Afghanistan blamed it on Pakistan. And fairly so, to an extent. I mean, it's not obviously the only issue, but the link between the instability in Afghanistan to Pakistan is undeniable.
Okay. Sorry, the microphone.
Bob Lawton. You mentioned in one of your responses resources. What effect do you think an America in recession would have on resources? Is it likely that Iraq might be wound up and a concentration made on Afghanistan? What are your views?
I don't think that the current recession probably would affect the immediate warfighting effort, but where it would affect it is in the rebuilding of our military. Our militaries have gone through a tough beating, both in fighting Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's a clear need to, give our soldiers rest, give our equipment some rest, replace our battered equipment, all of these kind of things. And these are long-term effects that if our economy is not doing very well, our resources aren't going to be put into that, and that's going to see a clear deterioration of our military's capabilities in the long term. But in the immediate term, I don't think, these issues that you hear of in terms of the financial crisis immediately impacting the warfighting effort. I think what we need to look at is this, long-term regeneration of our militaries. That could be an issue.
In the back.
Chris Dooley. I've got two questions. One is also relating to resources. You've talked about military expenditure and also about reconstruction, institution building. What about the split of $1 between these two activities? How do you think it's been done? Should it have been done differently or better? And also relating to reconstruction efforts, you've touched on donor harmonization. How could that be done better?
I think that if you talk to those in the aid community, they say they clearly are not getting as many resources they need to in order to put their efforts across. Now, that's a result, I think, is of a prejudice toward military action, but it's also a sense that the military can do it better. Reconstruction can do it better than these aid organizations. I read something this morning saying that of 400 projects that were undertaken in one province, only 8 of them met World Bank standards. 8 out of 400, and those were all done by aid agencies. On the other side, the aid reconstruction projects that the military does, particularly in Iraq, are more effective because they have the resources. I mean, I would go all the time to commanders in Iraq to try to get, a project stood up rather than go through USAID or organizations like AusAid, because the military commanders had liquid funds. They had SERP funds just in their pocket, so they could just reach out and give me $50,000 and say, here you go, Lydia, get to it. Whereas the aid organizations, you had to get through this whole bureaucratic process and stuff. So I think that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why money doesn't flow into the aid agencies as much as it should. That's not to say that it shouldn't. I definitely think that there's more effort in that sense. You also see a greater reticence by aid organizations to get into these conflict zones. They say we don't have the security, we need this, that, and the other thing. And it's a real downer. If you have some aid guy coming to you and just saying, well, I can't do this. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to effectively do this. Whereas if you have a military commander who says, right, I'm going to just get to it. So that's a dynamic at play. And sorry, your second question was about aid, harmonization of donor aid. It's clearly wanting in Afghanistan, also to Iraq, but to a lesser extent it's important because of the oil resources that go into. Again, I can't speak too much of an expertise in terms of donor aid because it's a convoluted process that I'm still trying to wrap my head around as well. It's clearly very complicated, but I think one of the major things politically is to keep promises of aid to their word. So oftentimes you get countries promising aid and failing to deliver. So greater effort in terms of keeping them on track and poking them. Well, we have an IOU from you. You better deliver is probably a good way to go.
Yep, just here.
Yaroslav Petrik, I'd like to ask about the first point that you made, and that's the need to work on a grassroots level rather than through regional or local partners. And I'd say that all my worries are that it doesn't really live up to the needs for all local ownership and the participation of local population, which the aid community believes it's a prerequisite for any reconstruction project to be successful. Mm-hmm. So I would say that you can't simply avoid some kind of decision-making on a local level. And so I would say it's more a question of working with the right partners and admitting that sometimes you simply make a mistake.
Yeah, I think the point I was trying to come across is not that you shouldn't work with local partners, but you need to work with local partners. What I was merely saying is that oftentimes these usurpers kind of sweep in who talk the right talk and over-deliver. And we spend all our energies with them. So finding the right partners is crucial, definitely, and more local, the better.
Mark O'Neill. Sorry, down here first.
Hi, Llewellyn Jenkins. There's been a lot of talk about politics. There'll be a new US president in a couple of months. I'm just curious on your perspective, what each of the candidates would bring on the ground in each of these conflicts, and in particular to its neighbours and relationships.
I think that's a question that every American voter is asking. What are these guys going to do? In Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that their election rhetoric is not going to probably be directly what they do because they have to appeal to certain segments of voters. But when they do get in office and they deal with the reality of the situation, they'll probably be pursuing very different policies. Obama comes to mind with that. He has talked a lot about the need to withdraw quickly from Iraq. Now he says he'll do it responsibly, but the time frame that he's putting forward is clearly very unrealistic. And I think that once he kind of gets into power, and even his own advisors have told him this.
If he gets into power.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to be fair here at the Lowy Institute.
Yeah. Sorry, misspoke. So, the realities of what they have to deal with is crucial. And the same thing goes for McCain. I mean, I think that his, tough it out in Iraq as long as we have to is equally unrealistic, because while we have stabilized it to a point, there's a clear limit to how much foreign intervention that people are willing to take in both of those countries. I, also recently read something this morning about how the Bush administration is going through this huge revival or review of its strategy in Afghanistan. It's almost like a little too late. I mean, he's clearly irrelevant at this point, and so while it's useful and hopefully something that either candidate would be able to rely upon if they do come into power, I think they both need to make their own assessments of what the situations are and act accordingly.
Mark O'Neill.
Mark O'Neill, I'm still from the Lowy Institute. Paradoxically, you're saying that we need to engage with the local actors and seek out people at the grassroots level, and yet counterinsurgency is about re-emphasising and restoring the legitimacy of the sovereign state and the government. There's a contradiction there, perhaps, and we're seeing this to a degree in Iraq with the Awakening Councils and the Sons of Iraq. By legitimising the grassroots and empowering those, you can be producing counters to central legitimacy and control. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think it's only a contradiction if those local actors are not integrated into the central structure. And they clearly need to be. And we're seeing that struggle in Iraq, as you pointed out. The Shia-dominated government is really resisting having those guys be involved in a real and meaningful and permanent way in the security services and in the politics. So there's a clear need to get that done. And it will be a contradiction until that is. So I'd say it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's only a contradiction if you do have that disconnect. But the key is to use local actors in terms of a bottom-up approach, not to disconnect them from the upper layers of government or the centralized approach, but to integrate them into the central approach. And the Awakening Councils are a clear example of the need to do that.
Yeah.
Lydia, John Darwin again. I just at a very personal level would be interested in understanding what it was like actually being in this region as a woman and also a woman of Egyptian origin with a very strong U.S. accent. How do you go getting about and protecting yourself and so on?
It was okay by me, but I think it was a bit disconcerting to some of the people I reacted with. I mean, oftentimes I'd go into these meetings and, these tribal sheikhs would be looking around being like, this is it? Like, this is who they sent to come talk to me? So it's a little bit that you kind of had to go through that barrier in the beginning, but after a while it was okay. You developed a relationship with people, you developed a sense of trust, and I think there's this kind of stereotype about cultures in Central Asia and the Middle East that's not altogether unwarranted, that's a bit prejudice against women in these type of positions. But what I found is once you kind of got past that initial barrier, they're willing to engage with you on an equal level. And so it wasn't a problem in the long term. So.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there for no further questions. I'd like to thank Lydia for a very interesting and very insightful presentation today.